Καλά πάμε. Ένα. Ένα, ένα, ένα. Ένα. Ένα, δύο. Οκ. Οκ. This is your mic. You're gonna be sharing.
Okay. Shall we start? You ready for stuff?
Hey Heidi, is that mic going to work as well? 'Cause I'll do a little. Yeah.
If you like. We'll do the Q&A from there.
No, I'm going to come and sit down. Move around, get nervous.
Good on you.
I like that everyone's whispering, it's so respectful.
We're pretending we're in a library.
Museum. You ready to go? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nikos Papastergiadis, and I'm the Director of the Research Unit of Public Cultures, which I'm very proud to say that it includes Jasmin Pfefferkorn as one of our founding members, as well as my good friend Scott McQuire, who's sitting in the audience, who really is underneath and above and around everything I do. But today's event is the great and wonderful occasion of launching this beautiful book by Jasmin. And Jasmin, for those of you who don't know, is also a postdoc at the University of Melbourne, postdoctoral fellow. She's on the steering committee for the Centre for AI and Digital Ethics, a research collective, and the co-founder with Emilia Sunde down here of Coded Aesthetics. She's a very active and dynamic and broad-ranging thinker and actor in the world of art and culture. Now, recently, Jasmin pointed out that our careers would be doomed if we ever co-published together. She says, imagine Pfefferkorn and Papastergiadis on one spine. People would walk out of the room rather than having to embarrass themselves with Greco-Germano pronunciations. I can imagine a generation ago we would have been forced to properly assimilate, so that she would be Jazz Pepper and I'd be Nick Pepper. But I bask in these comments and reflections because right now my most overwhelming feeling is absolute pride. I've had the privilege of working with Jasmin for 10 years. And apart from her irrepressible optimism and radiant positivity, it's also been a delight to work with someone who always finds an opportunity when confronted by problems, whose hunger for a theoretical framework is only matched by her attention to the details of everyday life, whose poetic disposition is matched by rigour, and whose ultimate goal in scholarship is to bring forth compassion, care, and curiosity into this world. These glorious qualities obviously make for a wonderful human being. I'm sure that many of her friends in this room would agree that her smile and colourful clothes more than light up even the most grimmest of Melbourne winter days. But being a great human does not mean that you are a good student. Scott and I had the pleasure of supervising Jasmin's PhD, which is the basis of this book. And there was more than one occasion where we had to put on a rather nervous smile as Jasmin announced that the next chapter could not be possibly written until and unless she undertook 1 or 2 more museum visits. Museums that she pointed out had to be visited in Japan, Germany, and the Netherlands. And before we had a chance to argue about the benefits of keeping the project nice and tight and manageable, Jasmin had already booked her flights. This book, as I said, had this genesis in the PhD. And the PhD was written as part of a wider ARC research project on Mona, Museum of Old and New Art in Tasmania. And it was particularly the research project was focused on the transformations that such museums make and their impact on the local economies and the way in which they're actually experiencing and producing something novel in terms of civic development, cultural practices, curatorial strategies, the engagement of artists and local communities. Now, that ARC project was a linkage project, which means that we were not only doing a study on and of Mona, but also working with and for Mona. So they were equal partners in the research project. So the whole museum team were our partners, the curators, managers and everybody else. And we had access to data generated from their very famous O device. The O device, for those of you who don't know, is that little iPhone-looking device that you pick up as you enter the museum. And when you approach an artwork, it gives you information about its origin, commentary from the curators, commentary from David Walsh, the Gonzo line, and so on and so forth. And if you put in a little bit of details about yourself at the end, the museum promises to send you the itinerary of your journey through the museum and also all the information of all the artworks you visited. So for free, you get a kind of catalogue, a digital version of the museum's contents and the exhibition that you've just visited. But what the museum also gets from your participation is data. How long you've stayed, where you've wandered, did you come back into the gallery after going out to the cafe, what's your socioeconomic background, what's your age, gender, how much money you probably spent. That sort of data is very beautifully and studiously acquired by Mona, and we had access to it. You'd think that would be enough for a PhD. You'd think that that's more than enough for a PhD in media and communications in particular. But no, especially when we saw that the data was more or less adhering to the sort of socioeconomic markers that most museums have about their visitors. But it was contradicting the hype and origin and narratives often associated with the museum. And so some of the members of the team were very excited about the hype and were carrying on with it a little bit too far perhaps, whereas Kate Booth and Jasmin were more focused on some of the tensions between the narrative and the information, the experiences of people and the stories that have been generated around the museum. So in a sense, that's where we begin to see Jasmin hitting her stride. Because, of course, she could have easily have strode her way through the museum and produced the kind of story that would have been very comfortable and would have been very, very manageable in Scott's eyes and mine. But no, she felt obliged to cross-check her experiences and insights with that of the public, and to really examine the claims and status of Mona against a wider range of public and private museums around the world. Now that's a huge project in and of itself. But then, of course, Jasmin decided to do something else. She decided that assemblage theory needed to be refitted and purposed for museum studies. So we have another PhD being written, in a sense. And if that ain't enough, she decided that she would really like to cross-check also the social engagement platforms of the museum against that of the new emergent practices around the world. So in short, co-designing the theory, rechecking the hype against the reality, rethinking the empirical data against everyday experiences and personal insights, produced a very exemplary PhD. I think Costa just lost the mic. Should I press a button?
In case you missed it, I produced an exemplary PhD.
No? Like I said, in case you missed it, and she produced an exemplary PhD, and that's a reference to Jasmin's mother who's watching. Now, having written this exemplary PhD and examined by the great professor from ANU, Kylie Message, we got the hint that there was a book in here, which we already knew, of course. And Kylie was very, very instrumental in navigating the pathway from PhD.
Technical difficulties.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay, now we're on again? Okay, sorry about that. Now, fortunately, I'm a very nervous person, and these little things are enough to knock me over. What I was saying is that through Kylie's advances and support, it was a very nice process where the PhD became a book. And in tonight's launch, we're going to have a slightly unusual and interesting process of going through the book and launching it. In a minute, Jasmin's going to stand up and do a short reading from the book. And then we're going to sit down and do a brief Q&A, the two of us, and then turn it over to you for questions from the floor. So, Jasmin, do you want to now take this opportunity to do a short reading from your book? And I think you'll need this microphone.
Thank you so much, Nikos. I was going to stand up, but I might sit down so that we don't have to fuss around with the mics anymore. Who was that person? We don't know her. Thank you all so much for coming. I'd like to begin just by acknowledging that we're meeting today on Wurundjeri land, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and express my gratitude for the deep culture and long custodianship of this land that I get to call home, and state without reservation that sovereignty was never ceded. I really appreciate all of you for showing up in person, and to those of you on the live stream, hi, hey mum. I'm really, truly humbled by your support. There are so many people here today who have really bolstered me through this process and through my many, many years of academia, and hopefully will continue to bolster me through my many, many years of academia to come. Please give me a job, University of Melbourne. Okay. So almost a decade ago now, I started researching the Museum of Old and New Art. I'll be referring to it as Mona throughout. If you read the book, you'll see that I've spelt it as if it's a name, not an acronym. I didn't write this in the book, but as a fun additional fact for everyone who's here in the room tonight, this is from a throwaway comment made by David Walsh, who is the owner-collector at Mona, who said that he always spells it that way because it anthropomorphizes the museum. So I picked that up and I carried that through. So it's not a very continuous misprint in the book. It was deliberate. So Mona's located in the working class suburb of Glenorchy in just outside of Nipaluna, also known as Hobart in Tasmania. As Nikos may have intimated, when I first started this research, It had recently opened to the public. It was seen as this really edgy, very cool museum with this eccentric founder, David Walsh, who had built the museum from his gambling earnings. It had artworks that were focused on the themes of sex and death. It hired people to work at the museum who didn't come from art history or business backgrounds. It was built as an underground labyrinth with tunnels and crisscrossing stairs to encourage getting lost. Mona was rebellious, it was anti-authoritarian, it had a zero fucks attitude. So reporting on Mona at the time really revolved around positioning it as this unique entity in the world of museums. And when I was in my early 20s and starting this project, I was very definitely drinking the Kool-Aid of that. But over time, again, as Nikos said, things started to niggle at me. Mona's special, yes, I'll die on that hill. It's one of the most special museums in the world as far as I'm concerned. But was it really an anti-museum museum? Why this binary? What was it set up against? So traditionally, museums have been viewed as relatively fixed or stable entities and very slow-changing institutions. But the contemporary moment is more characterised by motion than stasis. Museums around the world are building new relationships with other museums and various publics and organisations. Artworks and museum professionals are highly networked, and new institutional critiques are gaining traction and reshaping museum policy and practice. So in many ways, the practices and the ideologies of cultural authority, strict governance, top-down knowledge dissemination, and positioning the visitor as a spectator that we perceive as associated with this kind of traditional museum are being destabilised. And yet so many of these practices and ideologies can still be observed in museums today. And so I found myself assessing and reassessing the ways that museums are analysed, usually using a fixed spatial or fixed chronological approach. That didn't sit right with me. Recently founded museums use curatorial strategies that invoke this Wunderkammer Renaissance theatricality. Museums that privilege sensory experience over a conventionally educative experience are not necessarily more interactive. Private museums and house museums are on the rise, but they often collaborate with government bodies. And many museums make claims towards increased democracy, access, and representation, but continue to draw on Enlightenment rationales and colonialist legacies. Visiting museums today often means that you take on a variety of different modalities: spectator, participant, consumer, audience. The site of the museum has changed as well, beyond the physical walls and into digital layers and spaces. So the question was, for me, how do I understand this change and continuity? And it was at this moment that I realised that the scope of my research might be a tad bit bigger than Mona. Mona was definitely the catalyst for this kind of thinking. It didn't fit neatly into an existing typology or category. I already knew that. But I was also starting to realise that it wasn't this unique entity. It wasn't this binary set up in opposition to other museums. In fact, as the years went on, Mona saw some increasing signs of institutionalisation. They included a map, which they never had before, so that visitors were no longer lost. They could find themselves around the space. Mostly this was pragmatic, because turns out it's really annoying if you go to a museum and then you don't know where the bathroom is. They also began to collaborate with local council and government. I noticed that invigilators were increasingly telling people how to engage with the artwork. Again, to be fair, a lot of those artworks are a little bit dangerous, and so it is for your own safety, but still. Mona claimed to be democratic and accessible to non-museum lovers, but the museum is also full of niche art references and self-referential plays on museological tropes. It got rightfully into hot water over exhibitions and commissions, and rather than following through with their claim to not care what anyone thinks, they began to take responsibility for their place in the community, and they apologised for a lot of the things that they did wrong. On the other hand, Mona is still incredibly dynamic and incredibly playful. It still creates an openness and a dialogue with visitors that is often not discernible in other museums. It advertises itself through billboards, which some of you may have seen floating around the place, where it displays feedback from one-star reviews. It builds new tunnels down into the earth to house new acquisitions, and its display shifts and changes. I needed to find a different way to analyse Mona. I started visiting museums, a lot of museums, in Aotearoa, here in Australia, in Europe, in East Asia. I broke down all of the things that make up a museum: the people, the objects, the sites, the policies. And that on its own didn't tell me that much. Most of those things are all present in museums. But when I started to look at how those things interact with each other, I started to see patterns. And these patterns became my common notions. A common notion in assemblage theory is when the components of an assemblage work together to reaffirm the assemblage body in a way that allows us to perceive it as a coherent whole. I locate 4 of these in my book: the normative, the responsive, the affective, and the emergent. But unlike fixed categories, common notions can and they do change. When component relations shift throughout a museum and sustain this shift over time, our perception of the museum shifts as well. And this is what it means to see a museum as an assemblage. Components slot in and out. Sometimes they are configured in a way that allows us to see the museum as unstable. Sometimes they are configured to encourage particular interactions that exist over long periods of time. Regardless, they are always in a process of becoming. And this holds both the capacity to reaffirm a set of practices, but it also holds the capacity or the potential to take new lines of flight. So that's a little bit of background on how I came to this book specifically. And if you'll indulge me a little bit longer, I'm going to do a brief reading from my Affective Museums chapter. And hopefully I have bookmarked it correctly. Is this a throwback for you, Stingray? The following narrative is an observation of how component relations form an atmospheric presence that territorializes the affective museum. I turned to my visitation of the Liufan Museum in August of 2015 in order to explore how museum components interact to form an affective assemblage. The Liufan Museum is located in a small, naturally formed basin, with the museum built into the hillside behind and virtually invisible from the outside, save for a minimalistic concrete wall and courtyard. 2 boulders are set near each other in the grass before the courtyard, and a dark rectangular slab is acting as a wall between them. Another boulder and several trees appearing to grow seamlessly from the stone ground are positioned nearby. Together, it provides a soft transition between nature and the man-made. Walking into the entrance, concrete walls tower over you, the sky above turned into a slit of blue tinged with a whisper of cloud like a singular brush stroke. Making a U-shape, one follows the sky until reaching an automatic sliding door with a small foyer and a reception desk. The staff member manning the desk quietly points to their left into the gallery space. Moving through the space, it is hushed and minimal, a mirror to the works of Liufan housed within. The biggest room holds large canvases, Uffan's paintings occupying each of the walls. They exist uninterrupted, without descriptive plaques next to them. A wabi-sabi rock placed on a square of dark reflective material marks the centre of the room, performing the part of a sculptural piece found in other museums. Other visitors follow the desire line of the four walls, drifting from one work to the next in a systematic fashion. Appearing to be lit by a single light, a darkened hallway to the side offers another stone. Its shadow, a video projection on the ground. Throughout, an interplay of stone, of reflective squares and rectangles, wood and concrete, of minimal lighting and echoed lines shape the museum. Shoes are taken off to enter the final exhibition room. This room, furthest from the entrance, presents as an empty square, with simple vase-like shapes painted directly onto each wall, and an opening in the ceiling giving view to the sky. The room is remarkably silent, though during the time I am there, I'm always joined by at least several other individuals as visitors came and went. Most notably, as people come into the room, they, without direction, immediately sit or lay down on the floor and gaze either at the basic vase design on the wall or up through to the sky. This impromptu group meditation fosters a stillness, felt both in the atmosphere and within. It feels worshipful and calm. But in this room at the Li Ufan Museum, there is no fine art to worship. This tranquility is embedded into the space. There are no traditional prompts for sitting, no beanbags, benches, chairs, or even rugs, carpeting, or turf, just the hard concrete surface of the floor. So then what is the nature of this phenomenon, a collective, quiet resting in this particular space? One way of understanding this moment is that the boundaries between external, internal, and me, other, that I have created in order to conceive of myself as an assemblage whole, have been absorbed into the atmosphere. Of course, atmospheres are fragile and dynamic, and my immersion ends in this realization. Nonetheless, the processes of the affective assemblage, closely tied to atmosphere and sensory immersion, afford the visitor component the capacity to navigate the borderlines between that which is otherwise constructed as internal or external to the body. Consider Bachelard's proposition that our capacity for a response is first feeling and then thought, a reaction that comes from the soul before it is caught in the mind. As a researcher, this visceral experience is a difficult one to catch. It exists in counteraction to traditional frames of knowledge, for capturing a reverberation of feeling before it enters into a realm of personal or historical narrative is a difficult thing. And yet, as evidenced in my own reflections from the Li Ufan Museum, after the original reverberation, we are able to experience resonances, sentimental repercussions, reminders of our past. But the image has touched the depths before it stirs the surface. Breaking down the habitual distinctions between exteriority and interiority through embodied experience is not always realized in the visitor component of the affective assemblage. However, it can be argued that the processes and practice territorializing this assemblage predispose this capacity. The resources in normative and responsive museums, signage, security, wall plaques, all exercise a rationalizing role. The resources in affective museums, which engage haptic processes, exercise a sensory role. While somewhat paradoxical, due to the heavy spatial mediation by curators, the potentiality this holds for the visitor component is an extended temporal immersion into atmosphere. I'm going to finish it there.
I agree, that was a very beautiful piece of writing. Thank you for selecting that particular passage, Jasmin, because it did encapsulate both the scope of your thinking, the attention to the material details, and also the significance of the ineffable in the experience of art. And what's remarkable about an artist like Liu Fan is, you know, in his paintings you really feel and see the pigment and the brushstroke. And he has this beautiful phrase that says something like, each painting one brushstroke, literally, each brushstroke one cosmos. It's complete in its singularity. And you've given us a sort of portrait of that experience, which occurs first in the gut or in the soul, as you say, and then it slowly percolates its way through one's consciousness and mind. And we find words to try to approximate those sensations and feelings and impressions. So thank you for achieving that and giving us an example of how important it is to communicate that to others. I'm going to now ask you 3 questions, a little bit about the background and context and the theory and the concepts that you've deployed, to just give us a chance to open up some of the ideas you've given us through that passage you've read, and also how you described your own trajectory. First of all, you know, I'm really struck by the fact that that museum, Mona, which had this whole hype of being the anti and the new and the radical and naughty museum, actually was dependent on a whole bunch of conventions. How did you come to really see the interplay between the new and the old in that sense? And how did you see what it brought that was new? What was the best way to come into that way of learning and seeing and concluding your understanding of that museum?
Yeah, so I think I came to this idea of new and old and came to look at Mona in a particular way by actually starting with looking at the museum before you actually arrive at the museum. Mona is seen as a bit of a pilgrimage. It's a little bit out of the way. And there's a lot of museums that are like that. You've got Naoshima and Teshima in Japan. You've got Sisyphus in Norway. And so when you start to think about how it is that you get there, you're already starting to learn a lot about the museum. It's very different than going just in off the street into a museum that's situated in a city. From there, I think the key thing is to look at components, small components. So yes, you've got the architecture, you've got the journey, you've got the architecture of how you go there. With Mona, there were already so many different reference points from those things: pilgrimage, the journey underground. You know, all of these things are really throwbacks to classic museological theory, you know, the idea of the museum as a mausoleum underground. But also if you come in from the ferry, you ascend through these temple steps. Like, you know, there's so many different reference points there. When I'm actually in the museum, I look first at the things that are in the museum, the objects, the artworks, the signage or the lack of signage, in the case of Mona, the O device. And then I shift into looking at the people, the staff that are there, the other visitors, how they're moving around the space, what enables them to move around the space, what potentially works to change that modality. And it's only actually after I leave museums, this was maybe less true of Mona because I started approaching that in a slightly different way, but with other museums, it's when I leave the museum that I look at their online presence, that I read interviews with museum directors for that museum, that I read people's research about them. So for me, this difference of old and new in Mona, it came from a foundation in museological literature, which is why I also said in that preamble that I gave before the reading, you know, there are so many references there that are kind of at odds with this idea of open access and inclusivity, because if you don't have that background, you're more than likely to miss the fact that there's, you know, links to cabinets of curiosity from the 16th century, or that there's a play on the art worshipful view of particular artworks that they're trying to disrupt. All of those things need a base understanding in order to be able to get the joke, essentially. So yeah, and then with the newness, a lot of that came from the way in which it incorporated visitor feedback. I think that was really key in Mona in creating a sense of newness. They have a collection that's called Monaisms. It's kind of a oxymoron because it's a permanently impermanent display from David Walsh's collection. So all of these things are constantly very much shifting and dynamic. So even with all of these kind of historical references, there's always an element of newness there, but it's a lot of the time injected by the fact that you're seeing what other visitors thought of the space through interacting with the app or the O device.
Well, already you're giving us a sense of your method. The fact that you have to go there first, the physical journey is not only imperative, but precedes the intellectual analysis and discovery. That's very important, I think. And I now want to move from that material to the theoretical. I would like you to expand a little bit more on why you gravitated towards assemblage theory and how that helped you separate yourself from more conventional approaches which try to sort of situate the novelty of a museum through its own historical evolution, or by emphasizing the formal qualities of the artworks that it focuses on. So why did you gravitate to assemblage theory, and what do you think assemblage theory enabled you to see that you would not have otherwise seen?
So with assemblages, I think the way in which museums are often approached is by starting off with a whole, this fixed idea of what this museum is. And that can be spatial with a single museum, or it can be chronological, as you said, with that historical trajectory. And for me, coming at it from an assemblage perspective was about avoiding seeing it as a whole to begin with, and instead seeing it as all of these small things, components that interact to create this whole. So it's a fundamentally different approach at the outset from that more fixed spatial chronological approach. I think what it allowed me to see was twofold. So for, think more of putting my industry cap on, for museum professionals, it's about locating these points of interaction that are changeable, and that can do a lot for a museum. If you're wanting to aim towards a particular objective or a particular role, or changing that role, start with those interactions, and if you can pinpoint those interactions and shift their trajectory, slowly, your museum can re-territorialize over time. But perhaps even more importantly, for me, from a personal standpoint, it was about the visitor and the visitor experience. I'm a long-term museum visitor. I do love museums, and it was really important to me to take the assemblage approach as a way to highlight agency in visitation, and that's so incredibly crucial because these are, you know, the holders of our collective cultural knowledge, and we deserve to have a sense of agency and ownership in visiting these spaces. And so looking at assemblages and taking those points of interaction and understanding that those interactions inherently have potential is also about reclaiming a sense of agency in space.
Thank you, Jasmin. That's very, very solid and important, and I think it highlights the way in which the museum itself is a very dynamic feature, which is of course your subtitle, and you needed a theory that could literally keep pace with the object. Now, you then operationalized that theory by introducing these common notions, and you had four. Non-normative, which is about pedagogy; the responsive, which is about engagement with particular communities; the affective, which is about the sensory; and the emergent, which is about these new flexible spaces. Can you now talk very briefly, because I know it's 4 chapters you have to summarize, but very briefly talk about the interplay, and rather than the fact that these are linear or discrete notions. Just speak to the interplay of these and how important they are to the contemporary museum.
I will just quickly say that these, the titles, the names of the common notions, we were on a flight back from Mona, actually in Tasmania, and we workshopped them, so you actually deserve quite a lot of credit for the names of these common notions. Shout out to you for that. But yeah, so these common notions, the normative, I think, is the one that we're all very familiar with. It's that top-down pedagogical style of museum. You have very prescribed, quite linear movement through the space. The art is hung on 4 walls, white cube model, sculptural piece in the centre. You know, there's that classic interaction order where you kind of like move along one after another, reading the wall placards. You've got invigilators kind of making sure you behave in the space, etc. And they hold that very like classic public service role. They're very much an educative institute. And I think the reason that we see those as so fixed and so unchanging is because they have this really long spatio-temporal trajectory, and so even when new components do slot into this assemblage, there's a stronger likelihood that they kind of get assumed or subsumed by that common notion of the normative. For the responsive, it's got some similarities to the normative. It's still very much educative, but for the responsive common notion, it places a sense of community at its heart and community responsibility, and it positions its visitors as constituents. So it has more of a space for this multiplicity of narratives, but at the end of the day, it's still the museum professional that makes the call on how the museum is operationalized. With the affective, as I read out, this is very much privileging the sensory experience of museums. It's about atmospherics, about immersion, about embodiment. A lot of these don't have wall placards. I think at their most reductive level, people might think of like very Instagrammable exhibits as affective museums, but what was really interesting is across the course of my visitation, all of the museums that I identified as affective actually had photography banned in the museum. And so what I started to realize was that the affective is very much about keeping you present within an atmosphere and keeping you immersed in that atmosphere. And And then you've got the emergent common notion, which is a little bit of a meta category, if I'm being honest, because the emergent common notion is a common notion that is self-reflexive about the fact that it is an assemblage. So it recognizes that it's always in a process of becoming, and as a result, it tends to be more dynamic, more focused around real-time feedback and quick response. And so I think the emergent is a difficult one because it's the one that gets institutionalized the most. It's the most dynamic, but it's the most fragile as well. It gets subsumed into affective, responsive, and normative as it starts to stabilize over time, which is really interesting. So the interplay between these, within my book, what I really wanted to do was not just articulate each of those as a common notion, but also look at particular cases where I'd seen one common notion re-territorialize as another, and try to understand how and why that had happened from that relational component interaction point. So there are times where you see, for instance, Maxi Museum in Rome began very much as an affective common notion. It was for its first exhibition with Hu Hanru as the head curator there, was an empty space. And so until the permanent collection came in, there was a focus on this auditory soundscape from, it was called Open City, I believe. But as other components started to come in and shift these interactions, it became increasingly normative and more representative of this kind of city identity in a different way that was more linked to governmentality and those sorts of things. So there are examples of these shifts throughout it, and really trying to break it down to look at which interactions occurred to either enable or constrain those things to happen, and which different components were afforded the capacity to affect back on the assemblage more so than others.
Brilliant. I'm going to do something rather bold, which is now to take this microphone and come out. Oh, you get another microphone, even better, because I was going to come out to you. It's like sort of, because now I'm going to take questions from the floor. So Costa
Somebody needs to run the mic.
can.
Okay.
Oh well, there you go. We've got a volunteer. That means you can ask the first question.
You don't have to.
No, you
Oh,
don't
no, I have
to.
one.
Emily is ready for the first question.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited for this book. It's brilliant. And I was thinking about, when I was rereading your chapter on how you establish assemblage theory this week, I got really excited knowing your next project, which is going to look at AI and museums in more detail. Because it dawned on me, something you probably already have thought about, is that this way of looking at or approaching space might be really productive thinking through AI art as method, specifically as opacity is something that's often seen as a problem when we look at AI, but how art can actually work with this space productively. So I was wondering if you can reflect a little bit about how you see this theory be repurposed for looking at AI art, and how, especially as museums are incorporating AI art into their museum exhibitions, how this assemblage theory then might evolve with that.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. So yes, a new bombshell has entered the villa, and that bombshell is AI, and the villa is museums. So with AI entering into museums, and thank you for allowing me to talk about my upcoming project, I'm looking specifically at generative AI, and that's so interesting when we think about that in parallel to assemblages, because generative potential, all of these things. But I'm most concerned with the kind of ethical tensions and repercussions that are accompanying this shift. So if I'm thinking about how I'll mobilize assemblage systems theory when thinking about AI, and not just AI in museums, but AI in art, and then AI art as a specific kind of method, which is, for those of you who haven't been in Amelia and I's office and privy to our conversations, is our way of distinguishing AI art from large image model outputs, for instance, so things that come out of DALL-E and those sorts of things, and instead thinking about AI art as an approach that works with AI as something that is not necessarily explainable, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. So with AI art, it's about thinking, or AI art as method is about thinking through the unexplainable as something that is productive for the imagination. And again, that's where I see it linking up so nicely with what I've tried to set up with doing in terms of assemblage systems theory here, is that it is very much about the potential of things, and we're at such a beautiful speculative tipping point right now that it's really exciting to think about trajectories, lines of flight, how this is going to end up morphing over time. And there's the ego in me that is obviously like, let me be a part of the conversation, let me shape this trajectory as a researcher, which is why I'm moving into that next.
I can fill that space. Oh, there's one back there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. If it's
Thank you, Jasmin and Nikos, for your enlightening presentation. And congratulations on a much-needed book. I haven't read your book, but I have a question. While I share with you the idea of the museum, of the digital millennium as an assemblage, I cannot accept anymore the colonialist and cultural imperialistic embodiment that a museum like Mona still embodies. Therefore, my question is, on the basis of your study and the Mona case to support your argument, in your opinion, is the collecting and displaying practice made in the name of a greater social good, or it simply happens with the purpose to capitalize and maximize the profits of the knowledge class, I mean global capitalism? What is more? In your opinion, an art museum like Mona, in a context of a data-driven economy, is prepared to overthrow capitalism? And if not, is it possible in the digital millennium in which we live to develop more ethical and sustainable collecting practices? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tommaso. Yeah, so I have a couple of things to say about this. The first thing that I'll say is that Mona as a museum does not have a mission statement. It has a brand values statement. So in terms of thinking about how it sits in relationship to a capitalist framework, that trajectory is very much there. But I don't like thinking about things as either or. They're always both and to me. And so there is a social component of Mona that's not without its tensions as well. But it's more political than other museums, which I personally appreciate. It does some really interesting things, and I think in terms of the social good around a museum like Mona, the social good is about the sociality that it aims to create and that it strives for. When you look at, you know, you mentioned the kind of the digital era, etc. And as Nikos said, another thing that I did was look at the online presence of museums and how they interact. And the thing that I was very taken with around Mona was that it was one of the few museums that I looked at that actually allowed for open dialogue and actually had museum staff responding to visitor comments. And that included even David Walsh responding to visitor comments. You know, you look at other museums and it will be so explicitly marketing content where they're mobilizing these new tools that have so much potential to encourage digital solidarity and new forms of community, and they don't capitalize on those new potentials. Instead, they are subsumed into the normative model. And something that Mona at least does is create space for productive antagonism. And I think productive antagonism is a social good. Oh, in terms of the data, hilariously, we use that data more than Mona did. Mona does not use that data. It's got such a veritable treasure trove. But I was speaking to Tony Holzner, who is the one of the founders of Art Processors, who made the O device, which captures the data, and talking to him about it, and he was saying, well, one of the issues is that with the O device, you capture the data after the fact, after the exhibition has been set up, after everything has been done, and you review it after the fact as well. So the curatorial staff do far less with that data than I think they even initially anticipated they would do in terms of shifting the museum exhibition around in response to how people were walking through the space, etc. It's only one instance that people have told me about where they've actually taken an artwork down because of how people were doing the Mona Lisa effect towards it. Yeah.
One more question. Back corner. Maybe this is the last question.
Back time.
Hello, Nikos and Jasmin. I haven't read the book as of yet, but I'm just curious about this emergent category of museums, and I don't know if you list, you know, what that sort of looks like, or, you know, experientially, or if there are museums sort of out there that you're tracking that kind of fall into that category. But I just wanted to know a bit more about what that is like experientially, and and if they're out there, and I don't know, I guess even knowing more about that transformation from emergent into those other categories, you know, over time. And I'm just curious about it all. I'm like, where does that sort of, you know, because I don't know, I've been listening to a lot also about what you've been talking about. I'm like, where does the line sort of blurs a little bit, in my opinion, between like artist run initiative, art gallery, museum, you know what I mean? Like it all starts to kind of, when you start getting into those less traditional categories, they sort of, I feel like they kind of blur together a little bit. So I'm like, what actually distinguishes such a thing? And what does that feel like experientially?
Thank you so much. Great question. I would agree. I think one of the things that I very much noticed was that private museums more likely to kind of end up falling into that emergent category. And I think that speaks to the point you're making about artist-run spaces and more alternative or radical spaces, is that there can be more of a freedom to be dynamic. The other thing that I think that you're drawing out is, you know, if all of these museums are in this state of becoming, then what makes the Emergent Museum, more special? And I think particularly because I've also set it up as a common notion, so something that we perceive as a stable whole but is actually unstable. So how does that come into effect? And I think I've boiled it down to the fact that in the Emergent Museum, as a visitor, how does it feel? You expect the unexpected, because those sorts of instabilities are planned into it from the ground up. They're a deliberate part of it. They're not a rogue component going loose. That's how it's constructed. So yeah, they feel very engaged, but like I said, also very fragile as spaces. Very haphazard, very chaotic, so many references to so many different things, and they're the ones that shift between the other three common notions as well quite quickly. I've seen at every museum there's often like a temporary exhibition or something like that that will play towards the emergent or play towards the responsive or the affective, but they do, after that temporary exhibition, go back to programming as usual, which is why I was very careful to talk about this like long spatiotemporal thing. And so far with the Emergent Museum, that spatiotemporal factor hasn't been as discernible. The one thing I'll say is I locate this shift in the Van Abbe Museum in the Netherlands from a normative museum to an emergent museum. And the reason I do that is, one, there's Charles Esch, the director of the Van Abbe Museum. In each assemblage, each component has material and expressive roles, and a material role is someone like a director or professional staff, etc. The expressive role is how you account for varying levels of agency and varying levels of capacity to affect back on the assemblage. A director obviously can change the assemblage a bit more than me as a visitor. Sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but this is a very exciting question because it really comes to the heart of so many of the things I found to be the biggest hurdles within my own work. So I'm very pleased that this has been asked. And so I located that because it started to rebuild from the ground up how much space there was for different components to affect back on the assemblage, not just for Charles Esch as the director, but really starting to figure out, okay, the space, the artworks, the people with their component relations, rather than having them narrowed down to one single kind of set of interactions. How can we reshape that so that there's several? And so in many ways, an emergent museum can be more playful, but it can also be more alienating, because if you don't already understand the codes of how to play in that space, it can be really off-putting and quite scary. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jasmin. Please allow me now to round off this beautiful occasion with some very brief concluding remark. Normally with a book launch, the emphasis is on the book, and I'm here to launch a book. But in this instance, because of this overwhelming feeling of pride, it's hard for me to separate the author from the object. And it's hard also because in this instance, your methodology is so much about your affective world as well as your intellectual capacity. And a much easier book would have been written if some of these distinctions were in fact made in a more polarized way, in the sense that you could have easily have sort of set up Mona as the radical new kid in the block against an ossified and straw man vision of the old museum. And that sort of code would have been quite easy to play the game that way. Similarly, you could play the game of this capitalist gambler figure who comes and wants to glorify himself and demonstrate his power through art. But in fact, as you observed, David Walsh is a much more complex character. He's in fact a much more interesting character for all his flaws, or because of flaws, or because of his willingness to portray his flaws, but also because of his insights into art and life and sex and death. They're not insignificant. And through that attention to detail, we see quite a bit of your own capacity to think of nuance, the way in which you see relationships, the way in which you see edges that otherwise are obscure. And I'm deeply moved by your capacity to connect these different things together, to hold different aspects of an argument together, the way in which you answered these very challenging questions. And sometimes I think to myself, where does this capacity to think like this come from? It certainly doesn't come from Scott or me. We're lucky to be witness to it, to be part of it. And I think I've got a little bit of an anecdote that might embarrass you, or possibly, but which to me gave a bit of a hint as where it comes from. On one occasion you told me about one of your other trips that you had to make to Europe, but you justified this one by saying you needed to be with your grandfather. And you told me about him and how meticulous he was. And he was meticulous in two ways. As an engineer, he was meticulous about the attention to detail. But as a person who loved your grandmother, he was even more meticulous about love. And I think this figure of your grandfather with this brilliant mechanical mind, this absolutely sharp analytical capacity, and this wondrous loving capacity also expressed something very profound about the qualities that I see in you. So I want to take this opportunity to say congratulations and thank you for being in this world.